Welcome to this most special of Thanksgiving Weebo specials, wherein the challenge is for me to be as offensive as possible while still refraining from getting my YouTube partnership revoked. That's right, kids. We toe the line here at Weebo Productions, and thus far, it has worked out for me. If you count working out as low view numbers, stunted channel growth, and limited upwards mobility. Success! Please share this video, please. Let the demonetization process begin! So Thanksgiving is controversial, don't you know? Yes. Horribly so. Not only is it a holiday steeped in cultural appropriation and frequently whitewashed by people, it's also regarded by some as a celebration of the utter conquest of the Native Americans. Yet, erroneously, it's embellished by the white man as a peaceful moment of, tranquility in our history with the natives. Because, you know, the white man, he's chronically incapable of putting down his musket just to sup with people who are visually different from him, utterly incapable of even a moment of unmarred tranquility. The only possible solution, according to the esteemed members of the ivory tower of scholarship in academia, is to replace our National Day of Self-Indulgence with a National Day of Atonement, coupled with self-reflective, collective fasting. Which is hilarious to me. The fact that someone unironically said that it would be ideal if Americans of all people in this world were to collectively take up a fast. Hilarious. As a national holiday, Thanksgiving has been celebrated on and off since about 1789, but wasn't officially a federal holiday until Abraham Lincoln made it so in 1863 as a national day of, quote, thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father, who dwelleth in the heavens, which is old-timey for give praise to the Lord. However, the first Thanksgiving itself, the one celebrated by the Pilgrims back in ye olde day, which was 1921, by the way, that's when ye olde day happened, that Thanksgiving was a celebration of the very first harvest, reportedly lasting 3 days, and was attended by about 90 Native Americans, as was documented here by Edward Winslow in 1622, a separatist who traveled on the Mayflower and was one of the senior leaders of the Plymouth colony. So, pretty reliable source, I guess you could say. Of course, though, despite a primary source, the date of the first Thanksgiving has been riddled in controversy. According to this article, some people think that Pilgrims considered the actual date of the first Thanksgiving to be July 1623 for some reason, which is ridiculous because that's 3 years after the November 11th, 1620 date, wherein the Pilgrims first arrived to Plymouth off the Mayflower. Yeah, 3 years after that, they had their first successful harvest and subsequent Thanksgiving as a result. Them Pilgrims, they must have had a real slow metabolism, don't you agree? The slowest metabolism ever to not have starved in the 3 years that they didn't have any food to eat. Okay. I mean, it's made even all the more ridiculous if we are to believe the accounts of near-constant colonial genocide done by the Pilgrims to the natives from the moment they stepped foot on the New World by internet journalists. Except that, no, actually, the real first Thanksgiving was in 1619, a whole year prior to the Mayflower landing in the New World. There was actually another colony that had celebrated Thanksgiving in Virginia, which is interesting in itself. I mean, what? We have multiple different groups of settlers on the shores of the New World celebrating their own version of the Thanksgiving? I thought that separatist settlers were all just one ginormous monolith of imperial warhammers hailing from England to rape and pillage and genocide and conquer the masses. What? Sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm not supposed to be discussing the genocide quite yet. But then I guess it's as good a transition as any, so why not? Let's hear the real history of the first ever Thanksgiving, straight from the horse's mouth, why don't we? The year was actually 1637, so about 17 years after the Mayflower first landed, and as the story is told by this Huffington Post writer, the body of a white man was discovered in a boat dead And in retribution for this just simply coincidental dead man, armed settlers invaded a Pequot village, setting the village, a village full of children. Sorry, hang on. A village full of soon-to-be dead orphans. There we go. Ablaze. Any survivors were not only sought out, but then also hunted down as well and killed. And that, my dear friends, that was how the first Thanksgiving, a holiday synonymous with unity and the Native Americans and colonials surviving the immediate year following the Pilgrims settling in the New World, was created 16 years after the fact. Step 1. Massacre an entire village of Pequot Indians. Step 2. Step 3. Celebrate Thanksgiving as a time of peace and unity. Step 4. Profit off of the dead carcasses of thousands of Thanksgiving turkeys. You'll have to forgive my imperialistically addled brain, please, but I'm just having the damnedest of times wrapping my noggin around this nonsense. Let's see here if I can possibly fill in the gaps for myself. Luckily, the Huffington Post writer did in fact provide a handy-dandy link to the website that she used as a source for this nonsense. It's called The Republic of Lakota. In this link, we find an article entitled Cooking the History Books, the Thanksgiving Massacre. Thank you to the author, Laura Ella, the Vice President of Native American Student Association, for her contributions to my head spaghetti. Laura readily admits that in 1621 Pilgrims did have the feast, but that it was not repeated years thereafter. So it wasn't the beginning of a Thanksgiving tradition, nor did the Pilgrims call it a Thanksgiving feast by any stretch of the imagination. The only reason why they were invited to the feast, in fact, was the purpose of negotiating a treaty that would secure the lands for the Pilgrims. The reason why we have so many myths about Thanksgiving is that it is an invented tradition, apparently. The alternate version of the first Thanksgiving that Laura gives us is coming from a man by the name of William Newall, a Penobscot Indian and former chair of the anthropology department at the University of Connecticut. This man has made the claim that the first Thanksgiving was a celebration of the massacre of 700 Pequot men, women, and children by English and Dutch mercenaries, the day after which the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving, thanking God that they had eliminated over 700 men, women, and children. And then it was subsequently signed into law that this day forth shall be a day of celebration and thanksgiving for subduing the Pequots. Now, how the governor of Massachusetts would know anything about the number of dead and who was the deceased the very next day is beyond me, unless the governor were there. Of course, there is no citation offered, there's no primary sources linked to, and I have so many questions. For instance, how do you get from the documented Edward Winslow account of 1922 to the Pequot massacre in the span of like 16-ish years? What happened during that time period to breed such aggression, honestly? Inquiring minds would like to know. So, inquire I did. Much to the chagrin of all of those news entertainers on the internet, let me tell you a little story, because context is key. Pequot are members of the Algonquin people, and according to Google Dictionary, the word has its origins in the Narragansett, another Algonquin tribe word, Pequotanog, meaning destroyers. Prior to contact with English settlers, the Pequot tribe boasted an estimated 8,000 to 16,000 members, depending on the source, localized in the Connecticut River Valley area of southern New England. In an attempt to control trade of furs and wampum throughout the Connecticut and offshore islands, the Pequot formed a tributary confederacy wherein dozens of tribes would be subject to them and obligated to offer tribute. That was done through the use of coercion, warfare, but also a bit of diplomacy and tribal intermarriage. For a time, the Dutch and Pequot controlled trade within the area until, of course, the arrival of the English settlers, which were a competing trade power that allowed the subjugated other tribes in the area the ability to wrestle themselves out from under Pequot control. The Mohegan tribe were one of the tribes subject to the Pequots, until rebellion divided them and the Mohegans gained their independence, reducing the overall Pequot territory. When the English settlers came to the New World, the Pequots further suffered a reduction of their overall territory and trade prospects as well. This bred conflict within the region, and that conflict had to do with dominating trade powers. The English were attempting to gain a foothold, while the Pequot wished to maintain their dominance within the area. Finally, in the summer of 1634, an English tradesman named John Stone and his crew were murdered on the Connecticut River by the Pequot. In July of 1636, trader John Oldham was also murdered by the Manassas Indians of Block Island. And of course, the English retaliated in August of 1636 with a raid that was attempted on Block Island. English forces were instructed to kill all the men and take away the women and children. Fruitlessly, they searched the island of the Manassas tribe and came up empty-handed, as the tribe had already fled the island. So the English burned a few villages and destroyed some cornfields instead in frustration. Next, English forces made for a major Pequot village with the intent to take the murderers of John Stone and his crew by force if necessary. The negotiations involved proved to be fruitless, and thus in retaliation the English burned the village, and one of their native interpreters actually ended up killing another Pequot. That is what started the Pequot War for the Pequot side of the issue. The Pequot laid siege to Saybrook Fort from September of 1636 through to mid-April of 1637, attacking any workers or soldiers who dared to venture too far from the fort, destroying cornfields, killing cattle, burning stores of trade goods, etc. During this time, the Pequot attempted to rally support from neighboring tribes in an attempt to defeat the English more swiftly. One of these tribes were the Narragansett, who were actually Pequot sworn enemies. The Narragansett decided instead to enter the war on the side of the English as their allies, and then in late April of 1637, the Pequot attacked English settlers at Wethersfield, killing 9 men and women and kidnapping 2 girls, who were later rescued by the Dutch. May 1st, 1637, the English finally declared war on the Pequot in turn and raised 90 men from Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor, placed under the command of Captain John Mason, with instructions to attack the Pequot villages of Mystic and Wineshank. Brings us to the oh-so-important Battle of Mystic Fort, or as the historians of the internet have told us, the Pequot Massacre. The combined forces of Captain John Mason, Captain John Underhill, the Mohegan, and other native Connecticut River warriors, numbering over 150, sailed to join with the Narragansett warriors in opposition of the Pequot. In total, 80 English, 60 Mohegan and River Indians, and 200 Narragansett marched to Mystic, Connecticut, to fight off the Pequot. At dawn on May 26, 1637, the 340 men began their assault on the village. English forces were split in an attempt to force entry at the southwest and northeast entrances, and met with swift resistance from the Pequot warriors within. Such was the resistance that the English feared a near defeat, and thus Captain Mason ordered that his men light the wigwams ablaze and retreat to form a circle around the fort in an effort to prevent escape. The victors set up temporary camps south of Mystic, waiting for their boats to arrive to carry them back after. And of course, the conflict doesn't end there. There were counterattacks launched, more battles and raids, and several other people died on both sides, different alliances breaking and forming, and all of the things. The end of the Pequot War, however, came in the form of the scalp and the hands of their leader, Sassacus, delivered to the colonists by the Mohawks of New York, once he had tried to seek refuge with them near the end of the war. Any remaining Pequot were hunted down, but were granted asylum if they decided to submit to the authority of either the Narragansetts or the Mohegans. Others were enslaved, but overall the Pequot tribe was declared to be extinct and prohibited from utilizing the name Pequot indefinitely. So this is what we call typical wartimey hootenanny. But I'm not in the business of justifying war nonsense. That's not my job. Actually, none of this is my job. I do this for fun. But my purpose here isn't to justify wartime actions. My purpose here is to expose the uncomfortable truth of things. And by no means is this story close to the one that we were told by certain news online entertainers. In fact, I believe some accounts trying to inform the masses about the, quote, real First Thanksgiving couldn't even be bothered to specify the correct tribe name, or report the non-exaggerated numbers of dead in addition to the high end of things. They couldn't even correctly specify that this was a joint effort by the English, Mohegan, and Narragansett tribes in retaliation for trade disputes, not the English and Dutch mercenaries. See, this is the most offensive thing about all of this hullabaloo, about all of this, is that everyone is aware of the general history regarding American colonists and Native Americans and the relationship there, but things are rarely ever so blatantly red versus white. Not the way that we think they are. As of January 29th, 2018, there were about 572 different Native American tribes legally recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. 572. Different tribes. Each with their own histories, traditions, cultures, contexts, just in today's world. I have no idea how many there were back in the 1600s or even before then. But 572 different tribes, separate from each other, with their own traditions and their own cultures and histories and practices, and with their own conflicts with each other. You see, you do a disservice to all Native American people when you refer to them as simply just one collective group of natives in a historical context, just as you do when you refer to any foreign settlers as purely European, or when you refer to any black person as simply African American. To equate a Mohawk to a Pequot, the Mohawks who effectively killed the last Pequot chief all those years ago, or to equate a Pequot to a Mohegan, the Mohegans who sought independence from the Pequots in such a way, denotes a complete and utter lack of willingness to accurately understand the broader histories that you're standing on the backs of to purport your own anti-colonialist narrative. I'm not denying that the American government did absolutely abhorrent things to the native populations of the United States. Obviously, they did. And the government owns that. They might not do right by the natives all the time, but they own that. And they know they own that. We make them own that, remember? But the United States government, that didn't come into existence in an official capacity until at least the Articles of Confederation in 1777. There are generations of separation between the first Thanksgiving and that. That's actually not the only version of history boxing that we get. That's kind of ignorant. A lot of people forget, right, that Cleopatra was born a lot closer to our time right now than she was born close to the time of the raising of the pyramids of Giza. There's a lot of time. There's a lot of gaps to fill. And there's a lot of things that people like to mush together for whatever reason. Because it fits in a box, I guess. And I have an issue with that. I have a really big issue with the blatant attempts at condensing and conflating history when the reality of it all is that there's a lot more complication and a lot more mess than everyone would like there to be. The period of time between the first European settlers and when the United States decided to expand into native territory rather aggressively are not on the same time frame. And before the United States government enacted genocide, it was not simply the colonialists versus the natives. And any simplification of that is just a lie. To illustrate that point, we started this video off talking about Thanksgiving. And somehow, we got to a point where people were taking the events of a war 16 years after the Pilgrims had first settled at Plymouth and retconned it to suit a narrative that better fit the cut and dry colonialist versus native genocide fantasy they've cooked up in their heads. How did we get here?